Racist officer detains black man, then learns he's the internal affairs chief. The golden hues of the setting sun bathed the streets of Sacramento, casting long shadows over the city as Malcolm Hayes navigated his way home. It had been a long day at the office, filled with endless paperwork and tense meetings, and he was eager to leave the stress behind. His black sedan hummed steadily, the air conditioning offering a welcomed relief from the lingering heat of the California summer. The radio played softly, a jazz tune, smooth and mellow, a subtle contrast to the honking and revving of the evening traffic. For Malcolm, this was his moment of solitude, a transition from the pressures of his professional life to the quiet of his home. But tonight, that peace was about to be shattered. As he approached an intersection, the traffic light flickered from yellow to red, and Malcolm instinctively slowed, bringing his car to a controlled stop. Just as he exhaled, rolling his shoulders to ease the tension in his muscles, flashing blue and red lights filled his rearview mirror. A sharp, authoritative wail of a siren followed, piercing through the cabin of his vehicle. Malcolm's brows knitted slightly, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. He glanced at the dashboard. His speed was well within the limit, and his car, clean and well-maintained, was in full compliance with all regulations. Yet, as he signaled and pulled over to the curb, he already had a sinking feeling about how this would go. The squad car behind him rumbled to a stop, and moments later, a tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped out, adjusting his belt as he strode toward Malcolm's window. The officer, Ryan Calloway, had the air of a man who had done this 1,000 times before, swaggering with the confidence of someone who expected compliance without question. His buzz-cut hair and squared jaw gave him an almost rigid appearance, and the gleaming badge on his chest caught the final traces of sunlight. As he neared the driver's side window, his fingers hovered near his holster, not out of necessity, but out of habit. Malcolm, ever composed, rolled down his window, keeping both hands visible on the steering wheel. It wasn't fear that dictated his actions, it was experience. He had seen too many encounters like this unfold the wrong way, and he had no intention of giving Calloway a reason to escalate the situation. "License and registration," Calloway said flatly, his voice void of courtesy. There was no greeting, no explanation, just an order. Malcolm obliged without hesitation, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached toward the glove compartment, narrating his actions as he went. "My registration is in here. My wallet is in my jacket," he said, not because he needed to, but because he knew better. Calloway didn't acknowledge the courtesy, only snatched the documents from Malcolm's hand and examined them with scrutiny. A beat of silence stretched between them before Calloway's gaze lifted, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You from around here?" the officer asked, his tone casual, but the underlying suspicion unmistakable. Malcolm met his gaze evenly. "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." Calloway barely glanced at it before tucking the documents under his arm. His stance shifted slightly, his fingers tapping against the leather strap of his holster. Malcolm recognized the behavior instantly. Calloway wasn't processing a simple traffic violation anymore. He was searching for something. An excuse, a justification, a reason to push further. "Where you headed in such a hurry?" Calloway continued. "Just going home," Malcolm replied, his voice steady. The officer's lips twitched into a smirk, but there was no humor behind it. "We've had some incidents around here lately," Calloway said, taking a step closer. "Can never be too careful." Malcolm inhaled slowly. He could feel the weight of this moment pressing down on him, the quiet but unmistakable shift in the interaction. He had seen this before, how a minor stop could become something more, how an assumption could turn into an accusation. Little did Calloway know, the man standing in front of him was not one to be intimidated. And tonight, Malcolm wasn't just any target, this was just the beginning. Malcolm Hayes had spent years ensuring that the power of a badge wasn't misused. But tonight, that power had been wielded against him in the most reckless and unaccountable way. As he stood with his hands flat against the hood of his own car, the cold metal biting into his palms, He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Officer Ryan Calloway moved with slow, deliberate motions as he patted Malcolm down, rougher than necessary, his hands lingering, pushing harder than they should. This wasn't just a search, it was an assertion of dominance. Malcolm had seen it before, had read about it in countless complaints that crossed his desk, but experiencing it firsthand sent a sharp current of frustration through his veins. He refused to react, refused to give Calloway the satisfaction of even a flinch. "You're clean," Calloway muttered finally, stepping back, though there was irritation in his voice, as if he had expected, hoped, to find something incriminating. Malcolm straightened slowly, turning to face the officer, his expression unreadable. "Of course I am." His tone was even, composed, but beneath it lay a quiet authority that made Calloway bristle. "Where were you saying you work again?" Calloway asked, folding his arms across his chest, still standing too close. Malcolm could see it in his eyes now, an attempt to reassert control over a situation that had started to slip through his fingers. Calloway had stopped him under the assumption that he was just another nobody, just another man who had no power, no influence. Malcolm's lips curved slightly, not in a smile but in something sharper. "I didn't say." Calloway's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, his partner, a younger officer who had stayed mostly silent until now, took a small step forward. "Sir, you're free to go," the younger officer said, though there was hesitation in his voice, as if he wasn't entirely sure they should be letting Malcolm walk away so easily. Malcolm took a step toward his car, but then paused, his eyes locking onto Calloway's. "You stopped me under the assumption that I was someone who wouldn't know my rights, someone who wouldn't know how this works." Calloway scoffed. "Watch your tone." Malcolm tilted his head slightly, considering the officer. "No, you watch yours." The words weren't loud, but they were sharp enough to make Calloway's nostrils flare. Malcolm pulled a leather wallet from his pocket and flipped it open, holding it up between them. The golden badge inside gleamed under the streetlights. Malcolm Hayes, Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division. The moment stretched between them, silent and heavy. Calloway blinked, then glanced between the badge and Malcolm's face, as if struggling to process what he was seeing. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The younger officer swallowed hard, stepping back instinctively. "Internal Affairs?" Malcolm snapped the wallet shut and returned it to his pocket. "That's right." He turned his gaze back to Calloway, watching as the realization sank in, as his posture stiffened. The arrogance, the smugness, it was all gone. In its place was something rawer, something closer to fear. "I oversee officer conduct," Malcolm continued, his voice smooth but weighted. "It's my job to make sure the people who wear this uniform uphold the values they swore to protect, to investigate when they don't. And Officer Calloway," he stepped closer, lowering his voice just slightly, "what I've seen here tonight, that's going in my report." Calloway's face went pale. "Now hold on, Malcolm held up a hand. "Save it." He wasn't interested in excuses. He had spent his career listening to officers like Calloway talk their way out of accountability, blaming protocol or instincts or misunderstandings. But this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. One that he wasn't going to let slide. Calloway's fingers twitched toward his belt, but Malcolm caught the movement, his eyes flicking to the officer's hand before locking onto his gaze again. "Careful," Malcolm said, his tone razor-sharp. The younger officer stepped in quickly. "Sir, we didn't know." "No, you didn't," Malcolm said flatly, "and that's exactly the problem." He reached for his license and registration, still clutched tightly in Calloway's grip. The officer hesitated for only a second before handing them back, his fingers trembling slightly. Malcolm took them without another word, then turned, sliding back into his car. He could feel their eyes on him, could hear the unsteady breath Calloway let out as he stepped away from the vehicle. Before Malcolm closed the door, he looked up one last time. "Remember this, Officer Calloway," he said. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." With that, he pulled the door shut, started the engine, and drove off, leaving the two officers standing motionless in the night. By the time the sun had fully risen over Sacramento, Malcolm Hayes had already spent hours preparing for the meeting that would send shockwaves through the department. Sitting at his desk, flipping through a stack of misconduct reports, he felt the weight of the previous night still lingering in his chest. The encounter with Officer Ryan Calloway had been troubling, but it wasn't surprising. It wasn't even unique, and that was exactly why he had no intention of letting it go. A knock at the door made him glance up. His assistant, Samantha Carter, stepped inside, her expression cautious. "Chief Holloway is ready for you," she said, holding the door open as Malcolm stood, grabbing Calloway's file and tucking it under his arm. As he walked through the hallways of the department, Malcolm took in the familiar sights. Officers at their desks, some engaged in casual conversation, others poring over case files. A few heads turned as he passed, their gazes flickering with curiosity, maybe even a hint of nervousness. By now, word had likely spread that something had happened the night before. Malcolm wasn't the type to make waves without cause, but when he did, everyone knew to pay attention. Inside the conference room, Chief Holloway sat at the head of the long table, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his uniform pressed to perfection. He had the air of a man who had seen everything, who had fought too many battles to be easily rattled. But as Malcolm took his seat across from him, he could see a flicker of something in Holloway's eyes. Concern, maybe even regret. "Malcolm," Holloway said, his voice even. "Samantha mentioned you had something urgent to discuss." Malcolm slid the file across the table. "Officer Calloway." Holloway sighed as he opened the folder, scanning the contents. He flipped through complaint after complaint, excessive stops, questionable conduct, disciplinary warnings that had never escalated beyond a slap on the wrist. "This isn't the first time his name has come up," Malcolm said. "But last night, it was my name on the stop report." Holloway's brow furrowed and he set the file down. "What happened?" Malcolm leaned forward. "Calloway pulled me over on a manufactured violation. He escalated the situation without cause, searched me without justification, and had no idea who he was talking to. He assumed I was powerless, just another citizen he could intimidate." He let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing, his voice sharper now. "And that's the real issue, isn't it? Because if this is how he operates when he thinks there won't be consequences, how does he treat people who don't have a badge?" Holloway exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Damn it," he shook his head. "This is bad, Malcolm. But what are you asking me to do? Fire him outright? You know the union will fight it, and—" "I'm not interested in handling this quietly," Malcolm interrupted. "That's the problem with this department. We sweep things under the rug, handle them internally, and let guys like Calloway keep wearing the badge like it's a shield against accountability." Holloway studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You want a full review?" "I want a review of everything," Malcolm said. "Not just Calloway, the whole department, the complaint system, the disciplinary process, the patterns we've ignored for too long. I want community input. I want an overhaul." Holloway let out a slow breath, considering. "You know this is going to piss off a lot of people." "Good," Malcolm said simply. "That means we're finally doing something right." The chief gave a small, tired chuckle, shaking his head. "You never did care much for making friends, did you?" "I care about making change," Malcolm corrected. Holloway leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the table. "All right, I'll back you on this. We'll initiate a full review. But you better be ready for the pushback, Malcolm. Some of these guys, they won't go down easy." Malcolm met his gaze without hesitation. "Then they'll learn the same lesson Calloway did last night. The badge doesn't make you untouchable, it makes you accountable." A slow smile crept onto Holloway's face. "Let's get to work." The department review wasn't just a formality. It was a declaration of war against the unchecked misconduct that had festered for years. Malcolm Hayes knew that. He also knew that some officers were already working against him, whispering in the halls, bracing for the changes he was forcing upon them. But if they thought resistance would stop him, they were mistaken. Within a week, the internal review was in full swing. Malcolm had ordered a deep dive into officer conduct reports, civilian complaints, and disciplinary records. He sat at the head of a conference table, surrounded by a team of investigators, analysts, and even community advocates, people who had spent years demanding the kind of reform he was now making a reality. One of them, a woman named Denise Carter, tapped a file with her pen. "The data confirms what we suspected," she said. "Over the past 5 years, a small percentage of officers, less than 10%, account for over 70% of civilian complaints. And guess whose name is on this list?" Malcolm didn't need to ask. Ryan Calloway. Denise nodded, along with a few others. And here's the kicker. Complaints from Black and Latino residents are far more likely to be dismissed or marked as resolved without any action taken. There's a clear pattern of officers targeting certain groups, escalating stops into full confrontations, and walking away without consequences. Malcolm felt the slow burn of anger in his chest, but he kept his expression unreadable. "I want recommendations, actionable steps. We're not just compiling statistics, we're dismantling a culture that protects bad cops." A younger analyst, Carlos Mendez, hesitated before speaking. "Chief Holloway is backing this review, but there are some captains who think you're taking this too far. They're saying it makes the department look bad." Malcolm let out a dry chuckle. "The department is bad. The only way forward is to fix it." The tension in the room was thick, but Malcolm didn't waver. He looked around the table, meeting every pair of eyes. "This review isn't about politics. It's about accountability. We're going to propose a new oversight process, one that actually means something. That means an independent review board, real consequences for misconduct, and transparency with the public." Denise nodded. "And Calloway?" Malcolm exhaled slowly. His days in uniform are numbered. The fight was far from over. But with every report, every reform, every broken system they exposed, Malcolm was pushing the department toward a reckoning it could no longer avoid. This wasn't just about Calloway anymore. It was about making sure the next Calloway never had the chance to exist. And Malcolm wouldn't stop until that mission was complete. Malcolm Hayes had always known that exposing corruption wouldn't be easy. But as the department review gained traction, the resistance became more blatant. Officers who had once exchanged casual nods with him in the hallways now averted their eyes. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. Some officers whispered about betrayal, others about an outsider trying to ruin the department. But Malcolm wasn't here to win a popularity contest. He was here to tear down a culture of unchecked abuse and rebuild something better. His biggest opponent wasn't just the officers who feared change, it was Captain Darren Monroe, a department veteran with decades of influence. Monroe had made his stance clear in private meetings and through subtle acts of defiance. He had been one of Calloway's strongest defenders, arguing that policing isn't pretty and that Malcolm's review was nothing more than a witch hunt against hardworking officers. That morning, as Malcolm stepped into the conference room for a briefing, Monroe was already there, arms crossed, surrounded by a handful of officers who shared his resentment. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. "We need to talk," Monroe said, his voice low but firm. Malcolm didn't hesitate. "Then talk." Monroe stepped forward, his jaw tight. "This review, this whole crusade of yours, it's putting targets on our backs. You've got officers scared to do their jobs. You're taking the word of civilians over your own men." Malcolm met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm taking the word of the truth over a broken system. If officers are afraid to do their jobs the right way, maybe they were never doing them right in the first place." One of Monroe's officers scoffed under his breath, and Monroe's nostrils flared. "You've been here, what, 6 months? And you think you know this department better than the men who built it?" Malcolm took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it cut sharper. "What I know, Captain, is that some of the men who built this department also built a culture of intimidation, corruption, and abuse. And that stops now." Monroe's hands balled into fists at his sides. "You think you can just change everything overnight? You think the guys in this room will let you?" Malcolm let the silence hang for a second. Then, with a calm smile, he dropped the hammer. "They don't have a choice. The room went silent. Malcolm stepped past Monroe and took his seat at the head of the table. "Now let's talk about how we're going to move this department forward. And Captain Monroe, if you're not on board with that, you're welcome to find the door." Monroe didn't move, but Malcolm could see it, the realization setting in. This wasn't his department anymore. Change had arrived, whether they liked it or not. The pressure was mounting, and Malcolm Hayes could feel it from every direction. The review had started a firestorm, one that wasn't just contained to the department anymore. Local news outlets had picked up the story, and community members were beginning to ask tough questions. Why had so many complaints been ignored? Why were officers with multiple violations still on the force? And most importantly, why had it taken this long for someone to do something about it? The scrutiny only fueled the resentment within the department. Whispers had turned into outright hostility. Officers who once greeted Malcolm with professional courtesy now barely acknowledged him. Some took their defiance further, conveniently misplacing reports, delaying internal investigations, and even leaking misleading information to the press, painting Malcolm as an outsider trying to destroy the department from within. But Malcolm wasn't the only one feeling the heat. Ryan Calloway was unraveling. At first, Calloway had dismissed the investigation, confident it would blow over like every other complaint in his file. But things were different now. Malcolm had made it personal. And for the first time in his career, Calloway was realizing that his badge wasn't an untouchable shield. It was a responsibility, one he had long since abandoned. One evening, as Malcolm locked up his office, he heard footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. He turned to see Calloway standing there, his uniform slightly disheveled, his face tight with frustration. "We need to talk," Calloway said, his voice laced with barely contained anger. Malcolm raised an eyebrow but didn't flinch. "Go ahead." Calloway took a step closer, his jaw clenching. "You're trying to ruin me." Malcolm exhaled, shaking his head. "You ruined yourself, Calloway. I'm just holding up the mirror." The officer's eyes darkened. "I've been here for 10 years. I've done my job the way I was trained to do it. You come in here, act like you know better than everyone, and now I'm supposed to, what? Apologize? Beg for forgiveness?" Malcolm took a step forward, his tone calm but firm. "No, Calloway. You're supposed to take responsibility. You're supposed to realize that wearing this badge means something. You think I'm doing this because of what happened that night? No, I'm doing this because of the dozens of names in your file. Because of the people you've harassed, intimidated, and abused. Because you thought you'd never have to answer for it." Calloway's fists tightened at his sides, but Malcolm didn't back down. "You have a choice," Malcolm continued. "You can own what you've done, try to make it right, or you can keep playing the victim and let this department move on without you." Calloway's breathing was heavy, his eyes burning with resentment. For a second, Malcolm thought he might swing. But instead, Calloway just let out a bitter laugh, shook his head, and walked away. Malcolm watched him go. The breaking point had arrived, and what happened next would change everything. The department had reached a boiling point. The internal investigation was wrapping up, and the findings were damning. Patterns of racial profiling, excessive force complaints that had been ignored, and a culture that had protected bad officers while alienating the good ones. Malcolm Hayes stood at the front of the precinct's largest briefing room, the weight of what came next pressing heavily on his shoulders. Every officer was gathered, their expressions ranging from nervous anticipation to outright hostility. This was the moment of reckoning. He cleared his throat and began, his voice steady. "The findings of this review have confirmed what many of us already knew. This department has allowed corruption, abuse, and discrimination to go unchecked for too long. That ends today." Murmurs rippled through the room. Some officers exchanged uneasy glances. Others stared daggers at him. But Malcolm pressed on. "Effective immediately, multiple officers are facing disciplinary action, and some will no longer be wearing this badge," he continued. He let that statement hang in the air, letting them absorb its weight before delivering the final blow. "That includes Officer Calloway." The room erupted. Some officers scoffed, others whispered furiously. Calloway, standing in the back, clenched his jaw but said nothing. He knew this was coming. "You all have a choice," Malcolm said, scanning the faces in the room. "You can either be part of the problem or you can be part of the solution. But let me be clear, if you're here to abuse your power, if you think this badge puts you above the people we serve, then this department is no longer your home." Silence fell over the room. Some officers nodded in quiet approval. Others, including Captain Monroe, folded their arms defiantly. Malcolm took a deep breath. This department doesn't belong to the past. It belongs to those willing to build something better. As he stepped back, he saw a shift in the room. Some officers still resisted, but others, the ones who truly wanted to serve with integrity, stood taller. Change was coming, and Malcolm Hayes had ensured it wouldn't be stopped. This wasn't just the end of an era. It was the beginning of something new.